Hey, welcome to Lecture 6, everyone. So this is an interesting lecture. Today we're going to cover security and force, but this is going to start a trend here of lectures that are really sort of developed around those theories of international relations that we discussed. So basically, I'm going to give you a topic here, and we're going to look at it from the different perspectives. In this case, it happens to be security and force. This is actually, in this course, is one of my favorite lectures to give because it really makes you think. There's a lot of different perspectives here, and it's not really clear. And I'll tell you, this isn't a place where I have clear, sort of definitive opinions because it's very muddled. This is also one I wish was we were doing in person because I think the whole thing would benefit from your sort of feedback and perspectives as well. But unfortunately, we don't have that opportunity here. But maybe in your assignment, you can reflect a little bit more on that. So let's go ahead and get started. So, security, when we use this term security, which is common in the international relations literature, it simply refers to the measures that you take as a state to ensure the safety and well-being of your citizens and your overall way of life here. Now, traditionally, for most of human history, security was thought of in terms of physical history, so keeping people safe from war and conflict and that sort of thing. But this notion is actually evolving over time with different threats. Obviously, in the last couple of weeks, we've seen, information security, when a giant balloon is flying over your country collecting information, even though it doesn't pose a physical threat. So that just demonstrates kind of how this has changed over time. Other things, states can engage in economic security by, for instance, aligning themselves with a currency or separating themselves from it. So part of the reason that Greece was so keen on becoming a part of the European Union and aligning with the euro was because their currency was in pretty bad situation there. So collectively, it probably brought down the euro when Greece became a part of that monetary system, but it actually helped Greece. On the flip side, much to do with Brexit was getting away from, some of the economic controls and limitations caused by the European Union. So those are examples of economic security there. And then increasingly, environmental security is a concern, right? The impacts of environmental disasters are increasingly global. The first public inkling that the Chernobyl nuclear accident had occurred was actually when the Swedes were picking up high radiation levels in their air. If you saw this past week, there was a train derailment in Northeast Ohio that's sending toxic chemicals burning into the atmosphere there. I haven't read too much about that, but not too far from the Canadian border, right? So that could very quickly become a global economic sort of situation there. So, as I mentioned, let's talk about security theory from the four sort of main perspectives that we've kind of covered here. And hopefully a lot of this will make sense given kind of how I introduced it there. So from the realist perspective, military power is seen as essential to supporting the primary objectives of a state to ensure its survival. So you'll remember when we talked about the realist perspective, it was like the survival of the state is the most important thing. And keeping our people safe is actually second to that as long as the government continues. War is under this model is seen as inevitable. Thus, security measures are of strong importance, and so that's why realist government leaderships build large militaries. According to realists, no other state or system can be relied upon to ensure the protection of your state. Now, as we talked about, the neo-realist perspective shifts this a little bit here and sees strategic alliances. So, for instance, the alliance between the United States and Israel would be seen as an example of kind of a neo-realist kind of bending to this idea a little bit. So, from the liberalist perspective, and we're going to spend a lot of time in this course covering that because so much of international relations in contemporary times is based on this perspective. They would argue that the best form of security is collective security, which comes through international alliances. So think about this as the model of, a school of fish, right? If you're a small fish, if you can be with 1,000 other small fish collectively, that gives you more security against sharks and other creatures. Defense of life and property, according to liberalists, are just causes for war. So liberalists aren't anti-war in that sense, but other reasons are unjust. So liberalists would look at the Russian invasion of Ukraine for territorial purposes and say that's an unjust war. Whereas from the Ukrainian perspective, they would argue that the protection of Ukrainian citizens citizens and their lives is a just cause for war. Complete security on one's own is impossible, according to liberalists, so you can't go it alone here. And they would also argue that anticipatory defense is unjust. So starting a war because you're afraid another country is going to start one would be unjust, according to the liberalist perspective here. So, constructivist perspective. So here we get a little, things get a little grayer. National security is achieved through creation of social bonds between states. And so, as we talked about with constructivists, if the people residing in those countries have a stronger alliance, then you're a lot less likely to go to war with one another. Cultural ties and the free exchange of values and ideas will encourage natural peace between states. So that was the idea behind, pushing more Western brands and Western ideas into the Soviet Union prior to the fall of the Berlin Wall. So that's why, seeing the first McDonald's there was actually kind of a big deal, because the idea would be that as we started to sort of share kind of cultural, norms and perspectives and viewpoints, that we'd be less likely to one day go to war. Constructivists would say that war is most likely to occur across states with wide varying cultural norms. So, think about many of the wars that the United States has been involved in the last, 2+ decades have been with, majority Islamic states, right? And so constructivists would argue that it was easier for U.S. citizens to acquiesce to go into war with these countries because, that is not the dominant religion in the United States. And so for the average American, they don't share sort of cultural or normative ties with that group. And so that makes it particularly challenging there. Now, from the critical theory perspective, says that national security principally protects the interests of the wealthy elites. So from a critical perspective, anything that we do is essentially to control or to maintain the power structures that create wealth and power and other things in a society. Critical theorists would argue that global conflict emerges from inequality and injustice. And so if you were to remove those, you wouldn't have a need for a defense because, everybody would be happy and there'd be no reason for conflict, because you don't have these great power imbalances. Critical theorists would point to many of the Scandinavian countries who have socialist economies and have maintained relative peace or have mostly avoided war for at least in kind of recent history. So according to critical theorists here, inequality is kind of the main security threat. And really you have to take on that if you want to, and that's actually more relevant than creating a military, or that sort of thing. So let's dive a little bit, deeper into a couple of these contexts. And we'll start with the realist perspective, but it's kind of quasi-neo-realist here. So under this perspective, states act aggressively towards one another for a couple different reasons. One, they would argue the global system is anarchic, so it lacks any sort of central authority. So even though, the United Nations, for instance, is trying to be that central authority, realists would say that they're really not. And we'll talk about the UN. Actually, that's a dedicated lecture later on. States will inherently defend claims to sovereignty. So realists would point to, again, what Ukraine is doing and saying, these are our sovereign borders. We're going to defend it to the end, essentially. Uncertainty leads to a lack of trust. And so, no matter how cooperative you might want to be with another country, you really don't know how they're going to act and what their motivations are. And then again, survival is the most basic driving force of a state to maintain its sovereignty and its power. This lack of trust that we mentioned pushes states to prioritize against self-defense over collective security. So realists would rather go it alone and build large militaries, and they see that creating that wall is the best means of protecting security, more so than cooperations or agreements with other countries. Now, this is really emblematic of the Cold War because this was marked by extensive nuclear proliferation, which we'll talk about here in a second, which again was sort of reflected this dominant realist perspective of the dual hegemony between the United States and the USSR, right? How many billions of dollars were spent for a war that never occurred. And realists would say, as we'll talk about here in a second, that it was this proliferation of weapons and nuclear weapons that actually kept the two countries from going to war, although just barely. On the topic of nuclear weapon proliferation, so currently there are 9 countries that have nuclear weapons, and you can see, the distribution there. Russia actually has the most numerically at about 6,000 there. The United States, you can see, is close. India and Pakistan, as many of you may know, that is a tense, sort of set of international relations between those two countries, Pakistan having broken off from India some time ago. Obviously, Israel is in a tricky security space there. China and North Korea, and obviously North Korea's proliferation of nuclear weapons is a particular concern for much of the Western world here. But this has created a considerable power imbalances, right? So for anyone who asks the question, why don't NATO troops go into, or UN troops go into Ukraine to protect against Russia? The 6,000 nuclear weapons that Russia has isn't threatened to use is certainly a factor sort of deterring that behavior there. Other countries have sought to develop weapons. So, excuse me, Iran has sought to develop a nuclear program, and that has essentially been stopped by a variety of U.S.-led sanctions that have kept them from being able to do so. Okay, so let's see what the duck says. So wait, how can we, as the only country to ever deploy a nuclear weapon, keep another sovereign state from building their own? So really, look, the explanation here is that Iran is classified by the United States as a rogue state, or one considered a threat to global world peace. North Korea is considered a rogue state as well. States will use this distinction to sort of delegitimize some of the sovereignty of this country and impose restrictions while not imposing them on others. And so while the United States has not stopped, made any efforts to stop Israel from developing their nuclear weapons, they certainly have with Iran. And it's in terms of how they classify those states, and that's how they essentially justify it. And this is said without any sort of understand. I'm just kind of explaining the situation. Certainly there'll be students in this class that have, very distinct opinions, particularly on the relationship between Israel and their Middle East countries there. Critics would argue that the U.S. nuclear weapons deal with Iran is principally in the interest of protecting Israel, because Iran has made considerable threats over time to Israel. And so there is a fear there. So to neo-realists, this is, ultimately in the United States' security interest to maintain this partnership. To liberalists, they would say it's a win for global cooperation, that this cooperation between the United States and Israel is maintaining peace. And then for a critical theorist, they would suggest that it's essentially a reflection of Jewish or Israeli power in U.S. politics. Again, these are none of my claims. I'm just setting up the different perspectives and what some common arguments would be in response to this question here. So going back to this topic of deterrence here. So when we talk about deterrence, we're talking about a military strategy where one power uses the threat of reprisal to preclude an attack from another here. This is generally seen as the principal benefit of having this nuclear proliferation here. It's based on this idea that you have the ability to retaliate after a surprise attack. So if a country were to invade or challenge your sovereignty, you can attack swiftly and immediately with devastating impacts. And it's based on this assumption that there's a will to retaliate, right? That people are going to want to send missiles kind of the other way here. It also sort of runs into this theory we refer to as the mutually assured destruction theory, and this will be on the exam, so remember this one. This is the notion that when two sides both have nuclear weapons that are opposed to one another, that the likelihood of them going to war is actually very little, and because that they both realize that ultimately nuclear war would destroy them both. So in the end, there's no real sort of benefit to this, and so it's one of the reasons that realists would suggest that it's good that the United States and Soviet Union both had nuclear weapons, because this idea of a mutually assured destruction essentially kept them from actually using them. Fun fact you see on the right there, for those that don't know, I mean, I'm not as knowledgeable about North Carolina history as I'm sure some of you guys are that went through the public school system. There is actually a nuclear bomb buried under a farm in Goldsboro, North Carolina there. So on a satellite map, you'll see this cluster of trees. That cluster is actually owned by the U.S. Air Force back in, and I can't see my notes because my video, when I film this, actually goes to the bottom right, so it's blocking it. But there was a B-52 bomber that crashed. It released 2 nuclear weapons during that accident, not to detonate them. One of them got held up in a tree, I believe, so it didn't hit the earth. But the scary thing was that 3 of the 4 locking mechanisms had failed. So if that fourth one had failed, the weapon would have gone off. So that's scary, because that would have essentially, turned the entire eastern U.S. into an uninhabitable, nuclear zone. That's how close we were to that. The other one, actually, its safety locks all worked, but it buried itself, I believe, I can't remember how far, 100, 200 feet into the earth there. They can't safely get it. It's not a threat, but the Air Force basically just bought the land around it there. So let's switch to the liberalist or idealist perspective here. So this liberalist perspective is built upon, again, this notion that defense is secured through international agreements. This is known as liberal institutionalism, and this is a term you need to know because I'm going to use it sort of moving forward here. It's the reason for the United Nations, for NATO, these other intergovernmental organizations that we'll discuss in greater detail here. Liberal institutionalism advocates for these security communities here. So NATO is the best example there because it was principally designed to form a collective of countries to basically protect against the threat of communist or Soviet aggression. As you recall, there was the threat that Ukraine would align with NATO there, and that was largely an impetus for Russia invading Ukraine, and so NATO is obviously highly relevant there as well. Liberal institutionalism has been behind the creation of these organizations, NATO, the European Union, the Arab League, others, basically this idea of collective security here. I want to sort of break off here because relevant to liberal institutionalism is a model that's often used in international relations to explain, the actions of states, and this falls generally within the realm of what we would call game theory, in that you can create these games or simulations and try and predict how actors are going to behave. This is something I studied a fair amount in graduate school. It's some interesting stuff here. But one of the game models that comes out of it is known as the prisoner's dilemma, and it's relevant to international relations here. So let me set up the situation for you here. Two bank robbers have been caught. They're in two separate interrogation rooms that the police have them in here. There's a 2x2 matrix that you see on the right here that explains the possible scenarios here. Now, the most optimal scenario that you would hope, a liberal institutionalist would hope, countries, or in this case the prisoners, would engage in here, is that both end up both remain silent. So if both remain silent, if they don't confess to the crime, each incurs a small cost. So in this example, 1 year in prison for each there. And that's reflected actually on the bottom right of this matrix here. Now, if you have a situation where both confess and they both end up in 5 years. So again, not less ideal, but not the worst scenario. Where it gets tricky is if you have one prisoner who keeps quiet, per the agreement, and the other breaks the agreement and decides to confess. Well, the one that confesses gets out scot-free. They have no prison sentence. So you see that on the bottom left and the top right. Whereas the one that kept silent gets 20 years in prison. So the prisoner dilemma is often used to sort of explain or predict international relations agreements, right? Because you can't be completely certain that the other side is going to adhere to that agreement. When we talked about the Munich Agreement, for instance, in World War II, where the Western European powers had agreed with Germany and Italy that Germany wouldn't invade any more of Europe, and they signed this agreement. We know that Germany didn't abide by that, right? And so there was a cost associated to the Western powers in sort of reaching that agreement there and allowing Germany to sort of continue there. So that's the prisoner's dilemma. Under this model, liberal institutionalists would tell you that you should expect the bottom right to occur, that both countries will understand that there's a rational basis for coming to agreement and minimizing potential cost of both rather than just one or the other there. Now, let's switch to the constructivist perspective, and this stuff gets really interesting, and I think this is really sort of where you got to put your critical thinking cap on. I hate that expression. I can't believe I just used it. Critical theorists and other constructivists would argue that social structures bring about security more than material measures, so more so than, or less so than having, weapons. You don't need, weapons and military so much as you need these social bonds here. Such approaches point to the challenge leaders have in engaging in conflict with states for which citizens have a strong emotional bonds, right? So if we were to, let's say we found somebody who wanted to invade Canada, I think most Americans would be like, why? We like Canada. They make good beer there, and they have good ski slopes. I don't, I have Canadian friends, so I want to do this. What's it going to do for the NHL? So those would be factors from the constructivist perspective that would keep us from engaging that conflict. Much of this is backed by a theory known as causal attribution bias, and so that plays into constructivist perspectives as well. So let me take you back in time here. It's circa 2000, so actually about the turn of the century here. Young undergrad political science student is taking a sociology of groups class. That was just an elective, and my professor, a very tall German guy, super cool, Andreas Schneider, really like that dude. Anyways, he gives a lecture on causal attribution bias, and man, synopses start firing. I'm like, this explains so much. I ended up becoming a double major in sociology, basically because of causal attribution bias, and did some research in that space. But look, what causal attribution bias says, I know I've built it up a lot here, is that we are more likely to ascribe blame or negative stimuli to social outgroups. So people that we don't or sort of share an affinity for or an association with. At the same time, we're more likely to externally attribute blame for an in-group. So the best example of this is with parents. I was sitting at my kid's hockey practice yesterday, and as being a former actually public school teacher for a short while early in my career, made me cringe to the point that I had to get up because two moms were talking. And I'm going to say little Johnny because now every boy's name ends with an N, so we'll say little Brennan. Little Brennan's not, his teacher isn't preparing him. He's not a good test taker. We're going to get him tested for ADHD. And I'm not picking on this family here, but those are all external attributions of blame for the fact that little Brennan's, not doing well in school. And so we're very likely to do that when it's our own kid. Now, there's probably a kid, I'm thinking of the kid that picks on my kid on the bus, and I'm not going to use his real name, but it's got to end with N because, my sons are Keegan and Corbin and all their friends name with N too. It's a weird social thing. So Cameron. So Cameron, I don't like Cameron. Let's say Cameron's family, just culturally, they're a different religion than we are and that sort of thing. So Cameron's just a bad kid. Cameron, has been, raised poorly, that family. So I'm internally attributing Cameron's behavior, and I'll do that with an outgroup. Now, back up and look beyond my dumb example to things such as, for instance, two social groups that are facing oppression. You've got the Ukrainians, and I would use the Islamic Uyghur group in China, right? So both are facing different situations, but clearly being oppressed physically and in a violent fashion here. But who are we most likely to sort of emotionally engage with and see connectivity, right? Constructivists would argue that it'd be the Ukrainians because, look, they look like us. They wear the same clothes we do, generally share same, worldviews as we do. You look to, again, the Uyghur group, who is a, Islamic sect within China, right? Most Americans or Westerners might not feel a strong association with them. And so constructivists would argue that we're more likely to internally attribute what's happening to the Uyghurs to their behaviors or decisions or lack of action, whereas they'd be more likely to externally attribute what's happening to the Ukrainians to Russia and aggression, that sort of thing. Again, and this has nothing to do with either of those conflicts. I'm just setting up the situation that constructivists would create here, and this gets to this idea when you talk about Duck's coming. I can see him on the next slide preview here, so I'll save that point for that. So yeah, Duck says, whoa, so you're claiming that foreign policy is simply steeped in racism. I wouldn't say it's racism. I would actually say it's lack of information. So psychological experiments, and again, the cool thing about the social sciences, and if any of you go on to study it at the graduate level, you'll find this too, is that they all intersect, right? My graduate field, even though I was a political science major, was political psychology. So I took a lot in cognitive psychology because when you're trying to understand how people think, you clearly have to understand how the brain works, right? So psychological experiments have consistently shown that when we have very little information about an outgroup or a stranger, we look to descriptive cues to determine if we like them. So I would look at, if there was a photo in the newspaper of the Uyghurs in China, I would see that they're wearing traditional Islamic, garb. They're ethnically they look different than I do, and so because I don't know anything else about that group, or I don't know anyone from that group, I'm going to latch onto those things, right? So they've done experiment after experiment that shows that, if you take the same information in a news article, just change the photo. So if we just changed it to that cute Ukrainian kid being held, you'll get a different response. People will be more sympathetic there. This has consistently been shown over time. But if you think about it historically, for instance, think more domestically, right? So, I grew up in the South in Texas, where things for my LGBT friends and family were not very good, and some would argue they're still not great, but they were particularly bad at that point. But in large part, that was a function of the fact that not many people were out, so you didn't know. A lot of people didn't know or have openly gay friends, or they didn't recognize it. My uncle living in Southern California, very proud gay man. My dad went to his grave not ever knowing that my uncle was gay, and my uncle sadly had to keep that from him because it would have affected my father. At the same time, too, I wish my father would have known that someone he loved and cared for was gay, and that might have changed his perspective. Over time, clearly as people came out and as we have more gay, family and coworkers, you can see attitudes start to shift because we're gathering more information. That's probably, and I'm going a little beyond the bonds of international relations here, or the bounds of international relations, but I'm kind of trying to explain how this system works. You can kind of see it in the fight for recognition of trans rights, currently, right? Part of the challenges is that a lot of people just, we don't know a lot of trans people, and so it's harder to make those informational connections to learn about that, and hopefully that will change over time, and things will improve as people begin to understand and learn more about trans individuals in their community and that sort of thing. But the point being is that really it's information more than anything. Again, we're reminded that it wasn't that long ago that interracial marriages were seen as a bad thing, and actually legally restricted in a lot of places in the United States. It wasn't until we had friends and neighbors who were in interracial marriages and realized that, hey, they're doing great, and that sort of thing. So really it's just more information, I think, is kind of my response to the duck there. So that brings us to the critical theory perspective here. So, again, we've covered a wide array of perspectives. The Marxists, so traditional communists, aligning themselves with the writings of Marx, would argue that national defense isn't targeted at protecting the security of citizens, but rather protecting the economic interests of the wealthy. And then if you go into the different, we talked about critical feminist theorists, they would argue that the exclusion of women from defense roles has resulted in these norms of masculinity that have driven defense policies, that because when a president sits with a room full of generals, they're all male and they're all ready to go to war, that has affected our policies over time. Again, this is just from that perspective there. That would be, again, when we talk about the benefits of diversity, it's situations like that. It's like, well, what if there were more women sort of in the Joint Chiefs of Staff, for instance, that would allow those perspectives. Critical race theorists, on the other hand, they have all sorts of perspectives. A lot of that literature came out of the Vietnam War, and that's where you get these ideas such as minority groups are often used as a first line of defense, and that protects or distances the dominant racial group of voters from the perceived effects. And so if we send the argument of, if you look at the origins of the Black Panther Party of the United States, that was largely around Vietnam, and this idea or this belief among that group that African Americans were being placed as essentially the first line soldiers in Vietnam and suffering massive casualties, and that made it more or easier for white Americans to swallow the effects of the war, because African Americans, again, if we get back to causal attribution bias, were a social outgroup and they didn't identify with as strongly there. So, and then as you see on the right there, commonly protests against U.S. intervention in the Gulf, the first Gulf War and the invasion of Iraq. Critical theorists would argue that that has to do with U.S. energy interests and basically access to oil, and it's the reason why we don't do more to reprimand Saudi Arabia for its role in harboring the 9/11 terrorists or its killing of the journalists that we mentioned before too. So again, I'm not giving these. None of this is my opinion. I'm trying to paint the picture of these different perspectives for you here. I realize I was going to give you the code word on the previous slide, but I don't think I ever did. I was going to make it Goldsboro because of the nuclear bomb that's sitting under Goldsboro. So Goldsboro, Goldsboro, make that your code word for this week. Love to hear from anybody if you're from Goldsboro and you've seen that site. Leave a note when you give me that code word there. Let's talk about the changing nature of war here. So how war occurs has obviously changed over time. The biggest sort of leap, particularly driven by technology, was World War I, where we saw trench warfare essentially caused by the innovation of the machine gun. So now you can't just charge a line of soldiers with single shot rifles and bayonets because you're going to get mowed down by a machine gun. You have the innovation of the aircraft that comes during that time as well. So that changed the nature of war. If you look, forward, moving, beyond that, increasingly it's information that's becoming as important as weaponry in these global conflicts. So up until about the Vietnam War, there wasn't, a lot of press coverage of actual conflict. You didn't see the conflict occurring. You didn't see the videos. You couldn't connect with that on the screen. That's, unfortunately one of the reasons why, the Korean War is often seen as the forgotten war, because it just didn't receive, coverage. And at the same time, Americans were sort of kind of tired of war after coming out of World War II there. During Vietnam, you've got embedded press taking video and photos, and you can see the soldiers, being, dragged from the conflict, and that changed the nature of it. In fact, if you look on the right there, political scientists can actually map, and they've mapped basically sentiment in the news and media on the war to public opinion. So as coverage of the war became increasingly negative, as some would argue, because the war was going badly, public sentiment followed. So as we talk about public opinion later on in this course, we'll come back to this, because that's an argument in defense of sort of public opinion doing what it should, right? We're introducing new information and cues. And actually, this is global politics. We don't talk about public opinion in this course. Sorry, I'm thinking of my American government class. But this would be an argument for rational public opinion, that people are responding in a way that you think they would to the information they're receiving here. If you look at the Ukrainian conflict, right? Ukraine has been very tactical in its communication efforts. And look, as much as I hate public relations people professionally, Ukraine is employing them quite well in its social media efforts to build sort of Western sympathy to their cause, which has directly contributed to, countries like the United States giving military equipment and giving money to Ukraine to support this conflict here. So domestically, states do seek to control the narrative so as to minimize internal opposition to conflict. So you can absolutely bet that the military has public relations people trying to push a certain narrative and message to help their cause, because if they lose support in Congress and they lose the funding, and it makes it more challenging for them to engage in their warfare strategies. All right, a couple more slides here. Let's talk about terrorism and rogue state actors. So defense, as it pertains to terrorist organizations and rogue states, differs from traditional defense models because, for a variety of different factors, one being you can't assure rational actors. So things such as the prisoner's dilemma, these models are based on the idea that state actors and leaders are going to do what's in their best interest, whether it's through collective action. Rogue states and terrorists are a little bit different because they may not. They may be fine with being with mutual assured destruction because their own survival isn't as salient to them as the destruction of the ideology or whatever they are attributing sort of blame to here. Terrorism itself is a tricky subject because the term is heavily disputed. And constructivists would jump all over this because they would tell you that terrorism is entirely socially constructed. The UN's working definition is that terrorism is essentially coercion or violence in order to spread fear, to obtain political or ideological goals. So look, I'm going to be a little harsh here, but it paints this picture. A bunch of guys with AR-15 rifles standing outside a a drag show, for instance, would apparently, based on this definition, be considered terrorism. Obviously, we get back to causal attribution bias again, and I tell you, man, it explains everything. So why is this able to happen? You would have people in the community that would point to, the group of African American voters who marched on City Hall, and I can't remember the town it was a couple of years ago, and were peppered sprayed and arrested. Again, causal attribution would tell you that that's because the dominant political force felt threatened by that group, but they don't feel threatened by the guys that look like them holding rifles. Just sort of setting up these perspectives, agree, disagree. I have fewer opinions than I do ideas, and I just really like thinking about these ideas and concepts and how people behave and think. So I'm looking at it more as a nerd social scientist, but I'm setting this up for you so you can evaluate it yourself based on your own experiences and that sort of thing. So terrorism is typically only applied to non-state actors. So we generally don't apply terrorism to states, although you would certainly hear, some individuals would claim, Israel is a terrorist state. Others would argue that Palestine, the Palestinians, are a terrorist state there. But typically, in models of international relations, we don't do that there. You have some, some very, we'll say left-wing American historians and writers. Howard Zinn would be one, People's History of the American Republic. He starts that book off by basically reading from Christopher Columbus's diary, talking about how easily it would be to oppress the essentially natives of North America and enslave them when he arrived there. That's fun. You can see the quote here from Noam Chomsky again, explaining, terrorism as a rational response to, actions, committed from, another state. So, if Syria is doing all these things to, to certain Syrian, citizens, and they fire back, well, then they're labeled as, terrorists. Same things, with the Chechens, for instance, in Eastern Europe there. So what are the causes of international terrorism? So again, this is heavily disputed based on your perspective here, but if you look to the political science literature, here's a few things that pop out. Perceptions of inequality, so particularly when tied to a nationalist identity. So if you have a national group, and this is largely, according to political scientists, what drives a lot of European terrorism, is that you've had this influx of immigrants. We'll use the example of, Turkish immigrants into actually, we'll use Syrian immigrants into the UK and into London, right? Large group of immigrants, not a lot of economic opportunities for them. They're untrained, unskilled. They're in a new culture, a new system that fosters anger and resentment. And the argument here would be that could spur off sort of acts of terrorism. If you watch the Jack Ryan series on Prime, for instance, I think actually the first season of that did a really good job of setting this up. Just give you the backstory here. It's an Islamic terrorist leader and group, and it goes through his history of living in France and not being able to be hired and facing this oppression and ended up getting sent to prison there. Some people respond negatively, say we're trying to justify or legitimize the actions, and that's a fair argument. But I think that series, if you haven't seen it, actually does a pretty good job of sort of, playing that kind of story a little bit too. Skewed gender balance with regard to if you've got a population with a high proportion of unmarried males, so most acts of terrorism statistically come from unmarried males. And that's part of the situation too, because if you look at who is fleeing places like war-torn areas such as Syria and going to Europe, it's generally single males because they can travel alone. They don't have families. There's less baggage, and they are sort of the first ones to jump on the ship. And so you're getting a disproportionately large percentage of them ending up in these Western countries and fueling a lot of the anger there. Perceived oppression from a hegemonic power combined with poor economic markers. So again, this is a response to globalization. So, if you live in a Middle Eastern country where, Western oil interests or energy interests have come in, have taken your oil, your people are starving, that's going to build a lot of animosity towards, that economic entity or the country there it's from. Extremist, theocratic, or other ideologies. So really, anytime you have a belief system that is extremist or calls for violence, naturally that's going to be a catalyst for this as well. And these are sort of interdependent in the sense that, economically, when people are in a bad situation, these extremist ideologies tend to become more appealing to folks, right? So if you're desperate, you end up on the internet, you go down this rabbit hole of QAnon theories or other things there. It's very easy for that to be appealing when things aren't going so well in your life and you're kind of looking for an outlet. For instance, is what political scientists would tell us. And then the media has a role in this too, right? Agenda setting and influence, right? Depending on how sympathetic, they are to certain ideologies or groups or that sort of thing, or how much opposition they sort of put on an idea, that can contribute to terrorism as well. So a lot of explanations. I think the easy explanation that people try and use is that things such as you hear, like, they don't like our freedom or other things. But, political scientists have dug into this a little deeper, and there's usually some causal mechanics there, which is important because if you want to stop terrorism, the argument there is that if you understand how it flourishes and how it grows, if you can stop it along the way, then that's actually a better deterrent than, unique, security measures such as, having police and train stations and all that sort of thing. So let's look at terrorism from a few different perspectives here. Realists, for instance, and this is a little kind of expounding on what I've just talked about. Realists would see international relation theories as, struggling with this notion of non-state terrorism. So realists generally think of, conflicts between states. It was very hard for the United States to conceptualize the perceived threat of Al-Qaeda prior to the 9/11 attacks. And you go back and you listen to the interviews, and it explains that in the theory is that George W. Bush, the administration, didn't take the threat seriously because it wasn't a state. It wasn't Iraq. It wasn't Afghanistan. It was this group of non-state actors here, right? This policy, according to observers, they would say that the reason we invaded Iraq and Afghanistan, particularly Iraq there, is that we still couldn't conceptually think of a group that didn't have sovereign boundaries or governmental leadership, because our whole history was, conflict or international relations with those groups. We had never had to engage with a NGO, non-governmental organization such as Al-Qaeda. Looking at liberalism, so classic liberalism is rely upon states facing cooperative agreements and holding those states accountable to them. Well, the struggle here is that terrorist organizations are not typically willing to cede their ideology. They're not going to give up things to reach an agreement with another group here. It's also hard to sanction a terrorist organization because many of them don't have a lot of assets. Like, if your principal asset is an ideology that lives in people's heads, how are you going to sanction that, right? You can close bank accounts and other sorts of things, and you can blockade countries. But if you look at, for instance, the Taliban, which has retaken Afghanistan, that really hasn't been an impediment to them. Additionally, reaching agreements with these organizations can often be perceived as giving in to terrorism. So we have seen both sides, Democratic leaders and Republican leaders have essentially engaged in agreements with the Taliban government. And so we have an official agreement, and that was what brought about U.S. troops departing or fleeing Afghanistan quite quickly when that happened a couple of years ago. Last slide here, counterterrorism. So how do you respond to terrorism? Well, there's a mix of perspectives based on those models of international relations that we talked about. So the critical theory or constructivist approach would say develop a thorough understanding of the economic and social conditions of various international groups. That we could essentially label some group as being a high risk for being a source of terrorism because of their specific circumstances. That being able to do that would allow us to mitigate that and alleviate the possibility of that happening. We could understand the capabilities of terrorist groups to create programs to reduce their ability to attack. So this would be a little bit more of a realist and liberalist perspective here. Understand the intentions of terrorist groups so as to avoid rewarding any activities with concessions. So if we know ultimately what they're trying to achieve, this cuts across models there that we can help try and avoid doing anything that gives into that. And thus, the reason why, you've heard probably the U.S. stance that we don't negotiate with terrorists. The reason for that is that the first time you do it, then it incentivizes, additional terrorist acts, or at least that's the theory there. You can develop counter measures that reduce the viability of terrorist attacks. So this is a little bit more of a realist perspective here. I will tell you, in the airport world, I have a bit of experience in this, in that, when I was in Tampa, we had 4 separate security screening areas. And so there were constantly pushes by, consultants and other things saying, hey, you should consolidate airport security. So think the TSA line into 1 or 2 larger ones, because it's a better use of TSA personnel, gets people through the line quicker. One of our arguments that wasn't publicly discussed a lot was that if you have 4 separate security areas, there's not that many people in any one, and so they don't make good terrorist targets. If you're able to spread people out, you're able to mitigate some of the effects. If you have a group that's really just looking for a body count, which is a macabre thing to think about, but understand that those of us in work in airports and in the airline industry have to think about those sort of things. Of course, liberalists would say you create state alliances that discourage the harboring of international terrorist cells. And so, regardless of whether the ideology lives in people's heads, right, the individual terrorists have to live in places and they have to be safe in those spaces. So if you reach agreements with a variety of different countries, it gives them fewer places to set up shop and to proliferate there. So that was a lot, 45 minutes there. I apologize that it was so long, but there's a lot to cover there. And I just wanted to mention again, a couple things. If you missed it, Goldsboro was as in the city of North Carolina, was the code word there. The other thing is that I've communicated a lot of things and perspectives to you there. Again, I want to reiterate, none of this is my perspective or belief. Some of these may very much challenge your existing beliefs, and that's a good thing. That's what we're supposed to do in education, because I'm constantly, the reason I read as much as I do is to challenge what I think as well there. So don't want anybody to walk away from this thinking, I'm advocating for one thing or another, or being too supportive or nice to certain groups and not to others and that sort of thing. It's just a whole bunch of ideas. Stick that in your brain, let that ruminate, and you'll be interested to see what sort of comes out. So thanks so much, guys.